I do not think that the conditions are right now for substantive negotiations.
Well, when will they be?
That will be dictated by what happens on the ground and international politics coming together.
In which case you're calling for the overthrow of Putin and for Yevgeny Prigozhin or someone like him to have his finger on the Russian nuclear button,
Well,
which seems to me, as an international policy, to be verging on the daft.
Well, we've just come to, or coming to the end of the latest NATO summit, and the UK Secretary of State for Defence has caused a little bit of controversy by quoting things that he's heard and suggesting that the Ukrainians are a little bit like those that are the customers of Amazon when they're requesting weapons and bits and pieces. Peter, what do you think?
I think it's very interesting that Ben Wallace should start talking like this now. I don't think any British minister, or indeed anyone senior in British public life, would have uttered a whisper of discontent or disparagement of Ukraine for many, many months. And I think it's very telling that now there's some sort of possibility of some criticism of Ukraine. I think a lot of the major nations involved in this enterprise are beginning to think the time has come to find a way to bring it to an end. And I think this is very symptomatic. I'm sure Ben Wallace has thought it for many months, but it's fascinating he should say it now.
Yeah, interesting you say that. I think there is a frustration there, and we see that in US politics with the Republican-Democrat debate, and we've seen that in European politics through the different countries that are there. But I think part of the frustration and why he's come out with this comment when he did was his frustration at not getting the top NATO job. You know, I can't quite see Amazon, the size of the box that would be needed to deliver a Leopard 2 tank to Ukraine, and Amazon drivers getting that onto the back of their vans. But I think his language was clumsy and reflected potentially, from my perspective, a little bit of petulance at not having got the top job.
I have no idea. I don't know anything about the internal manoeuvrings of NATO or who is going to get the Secretary Generalship or anything like that. All I know is that whatever the immediate reason for him saying it may have been, I still think it's fascinating that such public disparagement of Ukraine should be emerging at all, whatever the pretext or particular reason for it. That is the important thing about the event.
But it's interesting that it wasn't a comment that was made in public. It was made off the record, not recorded. And whenever the leaders get together from a public perspective, they're completely supportive. And I think the interesting thing about the NATO summit was it wasn't just a NATO summit. You had leaders from the G7 there as well. And you've got two statements from NATO and the NATO leaders and G7 and the G7 leaders that meld together very well to give this promise of capability and support, whatever it takes, they've all said, to support Ukraine until the end.
Well, there you are then. But I've always thought that public statements were less interesting than private ones, and that when things leak, they generally leak for a reason.
Well, yes.
I spent many years working at Westminster, being leaked to, and I know how leaks happen.
But this wasn't a
seldom
leak.
accidental.
This wasn't a leak. This was an overheld conversation. But what do you think of the summit anyway, and what's been promised out of it, and the fact that Ukraine was going in expecting this magic open door to NATO membership, and that doesn't seem to have happened?
Well, first of all, NATO isn't a magic spell. It doesn't actually, by offering or giving membership to anybody, give them anything in particular. The fabled Article 5 is actually rather a weak clause in the agreement and doesn't commit anybody to anything much. NATO is only effective if people believe in it. If NATO is, as I believe it is now, seriously overstretched and unconvincing, membership of NATO isn't going to be that crucial anyway. And it was perfectly obvious from the start that Ukraine wasn't going to be given NATO membership now, because NATO will never accept a country actually involved in a current war. So that's really that. And the other thing is we know that the American military have been absolutely convinced since the beginning of this that everything should be done to prevent this war from getting outside the territory of Ukraine. If Ukraine became a member of NATO, do you think that American belief would change? Do you think America would suddenly want the war to escape outside the borders of NATO? I should think not. So I don't think anyone should rationally have expected much in the way of change. I suppose there may be people in Ukraine who are so bound up in this that they might have convinced themselves that something magical might happen, but I think that was always unrealistic.
Yeah, and I think Ukraine naively didn't realise the political machinations that are needed in NATO. We've currently got 31 countries. For any change, there has to be 31 countries agreeing in their parliaments or the equivalent for any political change. And it's hardwired within NATO that you cannot accept a new member who's in a current conflict, because you can't apply Article 5 retrospectively. And NATO wouldn't exist if you had to rewrite that. But I think what NATO's done at the end of the NATO Summit, from my experience, is unprecedented. To be able to set the conditions for a new member without them having to go through the membership acceptance programme, to put a programme together which is funded to help develop that country, both from a political perspective, economic perspective and military perspective, to get up to the NATO standards that are needed, is something we haven't seen before. And there has been a clear timeline. The timeline isn't set to a calendar date, it's set to an event, and that event is whenever the conflict finishes. And that's something that I think President Zelensky realised when he got there and managed to talk to people.
Well, it still doesn't actually decide how the conflict will finish or under what terms it will finish. So I don't think that necessarily means anything.
And that fits very well for where we're going next. We've had this big talk of the Ukrainian counteroffensive started a couple of months ago. President Zelensky himself has said it's going slower than expected. What do you think is happening with the counteroffensive?
I have no idea. I'm in no position to know. It seems to me that there's very little reporting of it which would enable anyone to form a picture. I don't claim to be a military expert. I'm prepared to believe that Ukraine might still be keeping in reserve large forces it hasn't used yet. It wouldn't surprise me if there was a major advance still coming before the fighting season came to an end. I wouldn't want to pronounce on that. It remains extremely difficult, however, for anybody who's dug in, as the Russians dug in, to be dislodged by an offensive. And I would be myself surprised if that happened, but I don't like to rule things out, because we've all seen in our lives many conflicts in which the unexpected has happened. And it's not for me to let my own prejudices or concerns let me run away with any kind of belief what's going to happen. I don't know.
Well, it's interesting, and my background is from military intelligence and a military planner. I've planned these sorts of operations and exercised them. Thank goodness, never had to execute them. But it's fascinating, and there's a few things that come to bear in it. And the first question I ask myself is, who's got the initiative? So who can dictate when and where something is going to happen? And at the moment, that's the Ukrainians. And that isn't dictated by a timeline measured by a calendar or anything else. It's dictated by what's going on the ground and the events that are happening on the ground. And again, we're in an unprecedented era where we've got the Ukrainians attacking in against a set of prepared defences that I don't even think we saw them on this scale during the Second World War. So
it's more reminiscent of the First World War, I think. It makes me think very much of the
First World War defences on
1916.
First World War defences on steroids, I think, because of the level of mines that they've got and the type of indirect fire that the Russians have got access to and everything else.
Germans were very good at building defences, and as it turned out in July 1916 at the Somme, and they were almost impossible to actually pass.
And the videos and things that we're seeing at the moment is things during the autumn months when it was very wet ground and all the rest of it. The fighting was exactly like the Somme, that sort of trench guttural warfare.
Doesn't change all that much. The power of the explosives changes, the range and accuracy of the bullets, I suppose, changes. The sort of body armour that soldiers have obviously improves, but in general, the war remains that kind of war.
It's a human activity
pretty much
between different people.
It's been since, I suppose, Gettysburg. Right?
Yeah, and the industrial levels that we're seeing with modern weapons and coming in different ways are absolutely horrific. But Ukraine's got the initiative. Their offensive operations are going slower if you're working on a timeline, and international politics likes there to be a timeline whenever they're providing support. But unfortunately, it has to be dictated by the events on the ground. And Ukraine hasn't committed its main effort yet, its main armoured thrust, because we've seen elements of it going forward. They're sort of penny packeting the Western armoured vehicles that they've got and equipment as they probe the Russian lines to try and find that weak point and to try and get through the initial defences so that they can find the channels that they can then push their large elements through. That could happen in a couple of weeks if they're lucky. It could happen in a couple of months. It may not happen until next year. The one thing that's holding them back is they can't create this bubble of air superiority that stops the Russians from flying helicopters and aircraft in to stop and attack the Ukrainian ground-based equipment and personnel, and that's significant.
I'm fascinated by the undiscussed level of Ukrainian casualties myself. A few weeks ago, the BBC Russian service did an excellent piece of reporting, and they did it, I think, by aerial photographs of cemeteries and by studying local media and reports, and they came up with what seemed to me to be a pretty realistic total of what Russian casualties have been. I've been waiting and waiting for someone to do the equivalent with Ukraine. I'm sure it's possible, but I'm told there are vast areas in Ukrainian cemeteries where the dead are buried. And I think Ukraine is losing, it's quite different from Russia in this case, Ukraine is losing the flower of its young men in a very, very serious, almost First World War way, either to death or to serious permanent injury, in a way which I find myself extremely hard to take. I don't like war. I think it's a stupid way of settling disputes.
War is horrible.
And I think that there must be a growing awareness in Ukraine of the cost, the human cost. We know the material cost. We know the destruction of infrastructure. We know the bombing of cities. We know the huge numbers of people driven from their homes. There must be a point at which people begin to say, well, hang on a minute, actually, the position of Ukraine in this war is not at all bad. The Russian offensive failed in its main objectives. It's stalled. It's unlikely. It seems to me extremely unlikely that Russia will be able to move much further from where it is. The time, it seems to me, to have come for negotiations between the two principal parties to the war. And I think those cemeteries argue most strongly for it. I think it's also time that people in the West who've been terribly gung-ho about other people dying and other people's cities being bombed began to feel the same way. I'm shocked by the way in which people who, in past years in Western societies, have been very sceptical about war. The way there is so little discussion of the need to bring this to a negotiated end, there will be a negotiated end.
There's a negotiated end to every conflict. War is diplomacy.
Almost, not quite
war is diplomacy by other means. And negotiations are going on today. There are negotiations going on behind closed doors between different interlocutors. The intelligence agencies lead on it. There's different diplomatic agencies that do it and all the rest of it. It's getting and understanding the conditions that are set for those negotiations to go more public.
Sure.
And to take things. And both sides have to agree on that. And I agree with you, there's going to be a limit on not just the Ukrainian side, but the Russian side as to when that limit has been set and negotiations are going to start.
Actually, I think Russia can probably stick it out longer.
Well, it's interesting you say that. The thing that caused Russia to withdraw from Afghanistan, when it withdrew from Afghanistan, were the numbers of bodies that were coming back and the Russian mothers rising up and causing real difficulties.
That's true, and Putin, I think, is very well aware of this, which is one of the reasons why he hasn't mobilised fully and hasn't attempted to
and one of the reasons why the majority of the soldiers he's using are from
exactly.
the eastern areas where he can control the information
and also
and everything
released
else.
Convicts. He's deliberately avoiding that. And and I think that it can probably continue to do so as long as the war is more or less stalemated along the line.
But I think this is where
Ukraine is sending young men in, and you hear it even with the, in my view, very penny packet, to use your phrase, reporting of the war, where small bits of it are reported. You hear horrible accounts of Ukrainian soldiers being brought back, hideously wounded,
but Ukraine is
to field hospitals, and
Ukraine is
there
very
are
carefully
deaths
controlling the information sphere.
Well, that's one way of putting it.
But it's one of the things you do in the
iron censorship in Ukraine, which normally, again, Western reporters would complain about.
But no, that's not unusual in this type of warfare.
I didn't say it was unusual. I'm just saying people would normally complain more about it.
What I'm picking up talking to Ukrainians and talking to other people is that they understand that the casualties are high, but there is still that resolve that's there. And it's that resolve, whilst that resolve is with the Ukrainian people, they are not going to turn around and give concessions to the Russians in negotiations. The Russians, whilst they think that they can still capture some territory, are not going to turn around and say we're going to withdraw from Ukraine, because negotiations could start tomorrow if Russia withdrew back to the internationally agreed boundaries, the pre-2014 boundaries of Ukraine, and negotiate then. And Russia could negotiate to get some of the territory back if they thought they could do that.
This is one of those, if we had some eggs, we could have some ham and eggs. If we had some ham, arguments that that isn't going to happen.
But if I stole your ham and you wanted ham and eggs, that's the difference.
That's true, but the point is this: there are going to have to be negotiations unless this offensive is successful, which of course neither of us have ruled out. But unless this offensive is successful, there are going to have to be negotiations, roughly on the basis of the existing lines of control, and that means however they're handled, that means there will have to be negotiations on that basis. And if you make a precondition of sweeping the Russians back to the 2014 borders, I don't know what your view is on Crimea, for instance, then you're basically saying that you don't really want to be any negotiations.
Well, no, it's not my view, and it's not up to me to say that. I agree with you that the sooner that this conflict can finish, the better. But the people that have to decide whether the conditions are right for the negotiations are the Ukrainians, and they set what they want, and that'll be influenced over time by the casualties and by the political appetite and all that.
Yes, but it's also
influenced by the Russians as well.
But it's also influenced by their supporters, and this is why I think the Ben Wallace outburst is significant. If the Ukrainians get the impression, or indeed the impression spreads through the intelligence agencies or wherever it is, that this has gone on long enough, thank you very much, then in Ukrainian politics the word will spread that something needs to be done. Ukraine can't fight this war without Western support.
To an element, but I think there's a much bigger picture that there is in here, and here's where it becomes even more difficult. The end state, if it is as I think it should be, the withdrawal of Russia, or the pushing Russia back to the pre-2014 borders, that could topple Putin. The toppling of Putin, because there's no natural successor, could lead to the breakup of the Russian Federation. That would be a disaster. However, if there isn't a robust statement maintained from the international community, given the fact that there have been very robust statements up until now saying we're with Ukraine until the very end, setting up that Ukraine's the final decision maker, then that sends a statement to Putin or Putin's successor that he can come back in 20 years' time and take another salami slice. It also sends a statement to Xi Jinping that actually if he did something and just rode it out for a few years, and he plans in 20, 25-year blocks, not in parliamentary or presidential timeframes, he could then
you have to make your mind up which of the two things you just said you believe. You've rightly pointed out that a defeat of Russia and the driving of Russia back to the 2014 start lines would almost certainly lead to the toppling of the Putin government and at the very least chaos in the Russian Federation, and who knows who might then have his finger on the Russian nuclear button. But you've also said that, that as far as you're concerned, the war has to be fought to the end. Well, what is the end? If it's not negotiation, the end is the very thing which you've just suggested. So are you in favour of negotiation, or are you in favour of the overthrow of Putin and his replacement perhaps by somebody much more like Yevgeny Prigozhin?
Really simple. I'm in favour of negotiation, because negotiation is going on now, and war is diplomacy by other means, and war is horrible, and it will have to be settled through diplomacy. But Ukraine will set the conditions for when it's right to negotiate by Ukraine. Russia will either accept it or reject it, and both sides have to agree that that's the time for them to start to negotiate.
So you don't think the Western nations who've supported Ukraine have any right to any sort of say whatsoever in whether Ukraine should be seeking negotiations now?
I think we can influence but not dictate.
Well, I didn't say anything about dictating. So you do think they have a right to influence?
I think there's continuous influence, because
if you were in a position yourself to apply such influence, would you apply it in favour of negotiations now?
I'd be applying it in favour of negotiations continuously, and there are negotiations going on today.
They're not substantive.
But the negotiations aren't, as you say, the substantive ones.
No.
I do not think that the conditions are right now for substantive negotiations.
Well, when will they be?
That will be dictated by what happens on the ground and international politics coming together, not by a timeline.
Sounds like never to me.
Well, it could be.
In which case you're calling for the overthrow of Putin and for Yevgeny Prigozhin or someone like him to have his finger on the Russian nuclear button, which seems to me, as an international policy, to be verging on the daft.
Well, you've hit another good debate that we could have, in that who could be the successor? Who could be the successor of Putin, and could they be worse? And the answer is they probably could be worse.
It almost certainly will be. Yeah.